In 1981, a routine garbage collection route in East Los Angeles became the stage for one of the most methodically planned cash heists in California history. No guns were fired, no alarms were triggered, and no witnesses came forward. Within 40 minutes, $2.9 million in unmarked bills had vanished from an armored transport, leaving investigators with nothing but tire tracks and a trail that went cold before the sunset. The case file gathered dust for 3 decades, sealed in silence by men who understood that some secrets are worth more than money. But at a funeral service in 2011, an aging sanitation worker named Eddie Morales stood before a small crowd and spoke words that would crack open a mystery the city had given up on. The morning of September 14, 1981, began like any other Monday for the crews at Metropolitan Waste Services. Located in a sprawling industrial yard off Whittier Boulevard, the facility handled commercial pickups across a dozen zip codes, from downtown office buildings to manufacturing districts. The operation was routine, predictable, and profitable. Trucks rolled out before dawn, followed predetermined routes, and returned by mid-afternoon with loads destined for the county landfill. Nothing about that particular Monday suggested it would become the focal point of a federal investigation that would span decades. At 5:47 a.m., 3 garbage trucks departed the facility as scheduled. The drivers were experienced, reliable employees with clean records and established patterns. Each truck carried a 2-man crew, and each followed a route that had been mapped and timed down to the minute. The 3rd truck in the convoy, a rear-loading compactor designated Unit 47, was driven by a man named Carlos Hernandez. His partner that morning was Eddie Morales, a 28-year-old father of 2 who had worked for Metropolitan Waste for just over 4 years. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. What made this particular Monday different wasn't the route itself, but what intersected with it. At approximately 6:15 a.m., an armored car operated by Pacific Security Transport was scheduled to make a routine pickup from a Federal Reserve processing center on Cesar Chavez Avenue. The facility handled currency exchanges for banks across the region, and Monday morning collections were standard procedure. The armored car, carrying $2.9 million in mixed denominations, would travel east along surface streets toward the downtown Federal Reserve building, a journey that typically took 25 minutes in light traffic. The route taken by Unit 47 and the path of the armored car intersected at exactly one point, a 4-way stop at the corner of Soto Street and Marengo Avenue. It was an unremarkable intersection bordered by small businesses, residential blocks, and a narrow alley that connected to the rear of a defunct auto repair shop. The timing of this intersection was precise, calculated, and entirely deliberate. At 6:31 a.m., Unit 47 approached the 4-way stop from the north. Carlos Hernandez brought the heavy truck to a complete stop, following traffic regulations he had observed thousands of times before. The armored car, approaching from the west, slowed as it reached the intersection. Both vehicles arrived within seconds of each other, a convergence that appeared coincidental but had been orchestrated with mechanical precision. As the armored car came to a stop, Eddie Morales climbed down from the passenger side of the garbage truck. He carried a small handheld radio and wore the standard-issue uniform of Metropolitan Waste Services. His movements were calm, purposeful, and entirely unremarkable to any observer. He approached the driver's side of the armored car and tapped on the reinforced window. The driver, a veteran guard named Robert Chen, had been with Pacific Security for over a decade. He was trained to be suspicious of unexpected contact, but the sight of a uniformed city worker at a routine intersection didn't trigger immediate alarm. Morales gestured toward the rear of the garbage truck and spoke through the closed window, indicating what appeared to be a mechanical problem that was blocking traffic. Chen lowered his window slightly, enough to hear but maintaining security protocol. Morales explained that the truck's hydraulic system had malfunctioned, causing the rear loading mechanism to extend into the intersection. He asked if the armored car could back up approximately 50 feet to allow a tow truck to maneuver around the obstruction. The request seemed reasonable, and Chen could see that the garbage truck's rear assembly was indeed partially extended. What Chen couldn't see was that the mechanical failure was entirely fabricated. The truck's hydraulics had been manually activated by Carlos Hernandez using a modified control system installed specifically for this moment. The extension created a visual barrier that blocked the intersection from view of approaching traffic while appearing to be a legitimate equipment malfunction. Chen radioed his dispatch to report the delay and received clearance to reposition the vehicle. He shifted the armored car into reverse and began backing slowly down Marengo Avenue. As he focused on his mirrors and the task of maneuvering the heavy vehicle, he failed to notice that Eddie Morales had moved to the rear of the garbage truck, where he was joined by two additional figures. The men emerged from the narrow alley that bordered the defunct auto shop. They wore dark clothing and moved with coordinated efficiency. One carried a canvas duffel bag, while the other held what appeared to be maintenance equipment. To any casual observer, they looked like utility workers responding to the same mechanical issue that had prompted the traffic disruption. As the armored car completed its backing maneuver, Chen found himself positioned directly in front of the alley entrance, effectively hidden from street view by the garbage truck's bulk. It was at this moment that the true nature of the operation revealed itself. The two men from the alley approached the armored car from opposite sides, while Eddie Morales maintained his position near the driver's window. The precision of what followed suggested extensive planning and rehearsal. One of the men produced a small device that he pressed against the armored car's rear door. The device, later determined to be a modified electromagnetic pulse generator, temporarily disabled the vehicle's communication and alarm systems without causing permanent damage. The disruption lasted less than 30 seconds, but it was enough to prevent Chen from calling for immediate assistance. Simultaneously, the second man approached the passenger side of the armored car, where Chen's partner, a guard named Michael Torres, was attempting to use his radio to report the unusual circumstances. The man knocked on the window and displayed what appeared to be official identification, though the badge and credentials were later determined to be expertly crafted forgeries. Torres, believing he was dealing with federal agents conducting an inspection, followed protocol and began to open the passenger door. It was a decision that would haunt him for decades, though investigators later concluded that his response was entirely reasonable given the circumstances and the quality of the fake identification. The moment the door opened, the operation shifted into its final phase. The men worked with military precision, speaking in low, controlled voices and moving with obvious familiarity of armored car procedures. They identified the money bags quickly, bypassed security containers holding documents and checks, and loaded exactly $2.9 million in currency into the canvas duffel bag. The entire transfer took less than 8 minutes. During this time, Carlos Hernandez maintained his position in the garbage truck, monitoring radio traffic and serving as a lookout. Eddie Morales continued his role as the concerned city worker, periodically checking on the mechanical problem that had initiated the entire sequence. When the money transfer was complete, the operation concluded as smoothly as it had begun. The two men from the alley disappeared back into the narrow passage, carrying the duffel bag between them. Eddie Morales returned to the garbage truck, informing Chen that the hydraulic issue had been resolved and traffic could resume normal flow. Chen, unaware that his vehicle had just been systematically robbed, thanked Morales for his assistance and prepared to continue his route. The garbage truck pulled away from the intersection, followed its predetermined path, and completed its scheduled pickups without incident. The armored car proceeded to the Federal Reserve Building, where the theft was discovered only when Torres and Chen attempted to transfer their cargo. By the time the theft was reported, Unit 47 had already returned to Metropolitan Waste Services. Carlos Hernandez and Eddie Morales punched out at their normal time, collected their paychecks, and went home to their families. The $2.9 million had vanished into the sprawling landscape of East Los Angeles, hidden by men who understood that the perfect crime isn't the one that's never discovered, but the one that's never solved. The investigation that followed was as methodical as the crime itself had been flawless. Within 2 hours of the discovery, Pacific Security Transport had notified the FBI, the Los Angeles Police Department, and the Federal Reserve's Security Division. The intersection at Soto Street and Marengo Avenue was cordoned off, photographed, and searched with forensic precision. Investigators found tire marks from the garbage truck, footprints in the alley, and trace evidence that confirmed the presence of multiple individuals at the scene. But physical evidence, no matter how carefully collected, means nothing without suspects to connect it to. The FBI began with the obvious starting point: Metropolitan Waste Services. The company's records were subpoenaed, employee backgrounds were scrutinized, and every truck that had been on the road that morning was impounded for examination. Unit 47 received particular attention due to its confirmed presence at the intersection, but the investigation quickly hit its first wall. Carlos Hernandez had worked for Metropolitan Waste for 6 years. His employment record was spotless, his references were solid, and his financial situation showed no signs of sudden wealth or suspicious activity. When questioned, he provided a clear, consistent account of the morning's events. He had experienced a genuine hydraulic malfunction, had followed company protocol for handling equipment failures, and had appreciated the assistance of what he believed were federal agents conducting a routine security check. Eddie Morales' story aligned perfectly with his partner's account. He had acted as the company's representative in communicating with other drivers affected by the mechanical issue, had followed standard safety procedures, and had helped coordinate the brief traffic disruption. His background check revealed a man struggling to support a young family on a sanitation worker's salary, but there were no red flags, no criminal associations, and no evidence of planning or preparation for anything beyond his daily route. The FBI expanded their investigation beyond the immediate crew. They interviewed dispatchers, mechanics, supervisors, and administrative staff. They analyzed work schedules, route assignments, and maintenance records going back 2 years. They looked for patterns, connections, and anomalies that might indicate insider knowledge or coordination. The deeper they dug, the more convinced they became that Metropolitan Waste Services was exactly what it appeared to be: a legitimate business whose employees had been unwittingly used as cover for a sophisticated heist. The 2 unidentified men from the alley proved even more elusive. Despite extensive canvassing of the neighborhood, no witnesses could provide useful descriptions. The auto repair shop that bordered the alley had been closed for over a year, its owner having relocated to Phoenix after a series of break-ins had made the location unprofitable. The building's current owner lived in San Diego and rarely visited the property. Security cameras were virtually non-existent in the area, and those that did exist had either malfunctioned or been positioned to monitor building entrances rather than street intersections. The electromagnetic pulse device that had disabled the armored car's communication system became a crucial lead. The technology required specialized knowledge and access to equipment that wasn't readily available to casual criminals. FBI technical specialists determined that the device had been professionally constructed, likely by someone with military or electronics industry experience. They compiled a list of individuals in the Los Angeles area with the necessary skills and began a systematic investigation of each potential suspect. The list included former military personnel with explosives or communications training, electronics technicians who had worked on security systems, and individuals with criminal records involving sophisticated technical equipment. Over the course of 6 months, agents interviewed more than 200 people, conducted surveillance on dozens of suspects, and executed search warrants on properties across Southern California. Every lead was pursued, every connection was explored, and every piece of evidence was analyzed with meticulous attention to detail. But the investigation produced nothing concrete. The men who had planned and executed the heist had covered their tracks with the same precision they had demonstrated during the crime itself. No one was spending large amounts of cash. No one had suddenly acquired expensive assets, and no one was living beyond their apparent means. The money had vanished as completely as if it had never existed. As months turned into years, the case began to take on the characteristics of a perfect crime. The FBI maintained their investigation, following up on tips and pursuing new leads as they emerged, but the trail had gone cold. Internal memos from the period reflect a growing frustration among investigators who had never encountered a case with so little evidence, despite such extensive planning and execution. Detective Ray Castillo of the LAPD's Major Crimes Division became the case's longest-serving investigator. He inherited the file in 1984 and would work on it in various capacities for the next 15 years. Castillo developed theories, pursued leads, and maintained contact with informants throughout East Los Angeles, but the case remained stubbornly unsolved. In his final report before retiring in 1999, he wrote that the Metropolitan Waste Services heist represented either the work of professional criminals with no previous connection to Los Angeles, or the single criminal act of individuals who had planned meticulously and then disappeared completely from criminal activity. The case file was officially reclassified as inactive in 2001, though it was never formally closed. By then, most of the original investigators had retired or moved on to other assignments. Carlos Hernandez had left Metropolitan Waste Services in 1985 to start his own landscaping business. Eddie Morales had remained with the company, eventually becoming a supervisor and training new drivers on safety procedures and proper response to unusual situations. The $2.9 million was written off by Pacific Security Transport's insurance company and absorbed into the cost of doing business. The Federal Reserve implemented new security protocols for currency transfers, and armored car companies across the country revised their procedures to prevent similar incidents. The intersection at Soto Street and Marengo Avenue returned to its routine function as a minor traffic control point in a neighborhood where nothing significant was supposed to happen. For 30 years, the case existed only in archived files and the memories of aging investigators. The men who had planned and executed the heist had achieved something remarkable in the world of organized crime. They had stolen nearly $3 million and vanished without leaving behind a single prosecutable lead. If the story had ended there, it would have remained one of California's most perfectly executed unsolved crimes. But perfect crimes, like perfect secrets, have a way of unraveling when the people who know them begin to face their own mortality. And in the spring of 2011, at a small funeral service in East Los Angeles, Eddie Morales stood before a gathering of family and friends to deliver a eulogy that would change everything. The funeral of Carlos Hernandez drew a modest crowd to St. Anthony's Catholic Church on a gray Thursday morning in March 2011. The 60-year-old landscaper had died suddenly of a heart attack, leaving behind a wife, 3 grown children, and decades of memories shared with the tight-knit community of East Los Angeles. Among the mourners sat Eddie Morales, now 58 and graying at the temples, his hands weathered from 30 years of physical labor, and his face bearing the weight of secrets he had carried since 1981. The service proceeded with familiar rituals. Father Martinez spoke of Carlos as a devoted husband and father, a man who had built an honest business from nothing and had employed dozens of neighborhood residents over the years. Family members shared stories of camping trips and birthday celebrations, of a man who had never missed his daughter's soccer games and who had taught his sons the value of hard work. The portrait that emerged was of an ordinary man who had lived an ordinary life, leaving behind ordinary grief and ordinary memories. When the time came for friends to speak, Eddie Morales rose from his pew and walked slowly to the front of the church. He had known Carlos for over 40 years, since they were teenagers working summer jobs at the same auto parts store. They had started at Metropolitan Waste Services within months of each other, had shared countless mornings in the cab of Unit 47, and had remained close even after Carlos left the company to pursue his landscaping dreams. Eddie adjusted the microphone and looked out at the familiar faces gathered in the wooden pews. He began with conventional words about friendship and loss, about Carlos's generosity and his commitment to family. But as he spoke, something shifted in his voice. The prepared remarks gave way to something more personal, more urgent, as if the weight of the moment had unlocked something he had kept buried for 3 decades. He talked about the morning of September 14, 1981, though he didn't identify it by date. He spoke of a decision that had changed both their lives, of a plan that had seemed impossible but had worked with terrifying precision. The congregation listened with growing confusion as Eddie described events that sounded like scenes from a movie rather than memories of their quiet, law-abiding friend. Eddie's voice grew stronger as he continued. He explained how Carlos had been approached months before the heist by men who knew about his route, his schedule, and his access to the intersection where everything would unfold. They had offered him money, more money than he could earn in 5 years of collecting garbage, but Carlos had initially refused. He was married, had responsibilities, and wanted no part of criminal activity, but the men were persistent. They returned with detailed plans, with assurances that no one would be hurt, and with threats that made refusal dangerous. They knew where Carlos lived, where his wife worked, where his children went to school. The choice, they made clear, wasn't really a choice at all. Carlos could participate willingly and profit, or he could be eliminated as a potential witness to something that would happen with or without his cooperation. The congregation sat in stunned silence as Eddie revealed the mechanics of the operation. Carlos had been given a modified control system for the garbage truck's hydraulics, allowing him to create the fake mechanical failure that would position the armored car exactly where the robbery team needed it. Eddie himself had been recruited as the inside man at Metropolitan Waste Services, someone who could provide credible communication with the armored car crew and maintain the illusion of a routine traffic incident. The 2 men from the alley, Eddie explained, were professionals brought in from outside Los Angeles. Carlos never learned their real names, and Eddie had interacted with them only during the final planning sessions, held in the basement of an abandoned warehouse near the rail yards. They were military veterans, he believed, men who understood timing, coordination, and the psychology of security personnel. The electromagnetic pulse device that had disabled the armored car's communications was the key to the entire operation. Eddie described how one of the professionals had demonstrated the device during their planning sessions, showing how it could temporarily interrupt electronic systems without causing permanent damage or triggering backup alarms. The device would give them the crucial minutes needed to complete the robbery, without alerting Pacific Security's dispatch center. Eddie's revelation grew more detailed as he described the aftermath. The $2.9 million had been divided according to a predetermined formula. Carlos and Eddie each received $400,000, substantial sums, but small enough to avoid immediate suspicion. The 2 professionals took the remainder, along with the responsibility for laundering the money and ensuring that none of it could be traced back to the original theft. The cash had been delivered to Carlos and Eddie 3 days after the robbery, left in canvas bags in the garage behind Eddie's apartment. They had been instructed to avoid any major purchases or lifestyle changes for at least 2 years, to continue working their regular jobs, and to never discuss the operation with anyone, including each other. Both men had followed these instructions religiously. Carlos had used his share to quietly pay off his mortgage and establish a small savings account, explaining the financial improvement to his wife as the result of overtime work and careful budgeting. When he left Metropolitan Waste Services in 1985, he used a portion of the remaining money to purchase equipment for his landscaping business, creating a legitimate source of income that would support his family for decades. Eddie had been more conservative with his windfall. He had invested most of it in certificates of deposit and treasury bonds, financial instruments that generated steady but unremarkable returns. He had used small amounts to cover his children's medical expenses and to help his elderly parents with home repairs, but he had never made any purchase that would attract attention or require explanation. The two friends had maintained their silence even with each other. Though they remained close, they never discussed the events of September 14, 1981. It was as if that morning had been erased from their shared history, replaced by the official version they had given to FBI investigators and repeated to their families. Eddie's voice wavered as he described the psychological toll of carrying such a secret. Both men had lived with constant anxiety, particularly in the months immediately following the robbery. Every knock on the door, every unexpected phone call, every news report about the ongoing investigation had triggered waves of panic. They had watched as FBI agents interviewed their co-workers, searched their homes, and scrutinized their financial records, knowing that a single mistake or inconsistency could destroy their lives. Carlos had handled the pressure better than Eddie. His natural calm and his ability to compartmentalize had allowed him to function normally, even under intense scrutiny. He had answered investigators' questions with steady composure, had maintained his work performance, and had shown no signs of the guilt that consumed Eddie during the early years after the heist. Eddie admitted that he had come close to confessing several times. The weight of the secret had affected his marriage, his relationship with his children, and his ability to find peace with himself. He had considered seeking help from a priest, but the fear of discovery had kept him silent. He had thought about anonymous tips to law enforcement, but the knowledge that such a revelation would destroy Carlos as well as himself had held him back. The statute of limitations had expired years ago, Eddie explained to the bewildered congregation. Neither he nor Carlos could be prosecuted for their roles in the 1981 heist, a fact that had provided some measure of relief as they aged and began to contemplate their mortality. But legal immunity hadn't eliminated the moral burden or the psychological damage caused by decades of deception. Carlos had begun talking about confession in recent years, Eddie revealed. The success of his landscaping business, the marriages of his children, and the arrival of grandchildren had given him perspective on what truly mattered in life. He had started attending Mass more regularly and had mentioned to Eddie that he was considering revealing their secret to Father Martinez, not for absolution, but simply to unburden himself of the weight he had carried for so long. Eddie's voice broke as he described his final conversation with Carlos, just days before the heart attack that had killed him. They had met for coffee at their usual diner, the same place where they had shared countless conversations over the decades. Carlos had seemed troubled, more introspective than usual, and had talked about legacy and the importance of truth. He had asked Eddie what he thought would happen if the truth about the Metropolitan Waste Services heist ever came to light. Would their children be ashamed? Would their community reject them? Would the good they had done in their lives be overshadowed by the crime they had committed as young men? Eddie had no answers to those questions then, and he admitted to the congregation that he still didn't know. But Carlos's death had clarified one thing for him. The secret that had defined their adult lives was now his alone to carry, and the burden had become unbearable. He looked directly at Carlos's widow, Maria, as he concluded his remarks. He apologized for the shock his revelation would cause, for the questions it would raise about the man she had loved and trusted for 40 years. He acknowledged that his decision to speak might seem selfish, a way of transferring his psychological burden to others rather than continuing to bear it alone. But Eddie explained that he believed Carlos would have wanted the truth to be known. In their final conversation, his friend had talked about the importance of honesty, about the corrosive effect of secrets on the soul, and about the peace that comes from facing consequences rather than running from them. Eddie stepped away from the microphone and returned to his seat, leaving the congregation in stunned silence. Father Martinez, clearly unprepared for such a revelation, struggled to find words that could address both the grief of loss and the shock of discovery. He spoke briefly about forgiveness, about the complexity of human nature, and about the grace that allows people to find redemption even in the midst of their failures. The service concluded with traditional prayers and hymns, but the atmosphere had been fundamentally altered. Family members whispered among themselves, trying to process what they had heard. Friends and neighbors exchanged bewildered glances, unsure how to reconcile Eddie's confession with their memories of Carlos as a reliable, honest member of their community. Maria Hernandez sat in the front pew, her face a mask of composure that barely concealed the turmoil beneath. Her husband of 37 years had apparently lived a double life, participating in a major crime and hiding the truth from her for 3 decades. The financial stability she had attributed to his hard work and frugality had actually been built on stolen money. As the congregation filed out of the church, several people approached Eddie with questions, but he declined to elaborate on his confession. He had said what he needed to say, he explained, and the rest would be up to others to determine. He spoke briefly with Maria, apologizing again for the pain his revelation would cause, and offering to answer any questions she might have when she was ready. Within hours of the funeral service, word of Eddie's confession had spread throughout the neighborhood. By evening, local news crews had arrived at St. Anthony's, seeking interviews with anyone who had attended the service. The story of a 30-year-old unsolved heist being revealed at a funeral quickly gained traction, and by the next morning, it had become a regional news sensation. The Los Angeles Police Department confirmed that they had received multiple reports about Eddie Morales' confession, and that detectives would be interviewing him about his claims. The FBI, which had originally investigated the case, indicated that they would review their files and determine whether any follow-up action was warranted. Eddie had expected the attention, but the intensity of it surprised him. Reporters camped outside his apartment. Photographers followed his adult children to work, and his phone rang constantly with requests for interviews. He had imagined that his confession would bring relief, but instead it had created a new kind of pressure, a public scrutiny that was in some ways more difficult to bear than the private guilt he had carried for decades. The investigation that followed Eddie's confession was swift but limited. Detectives confirmed many of the details he had provided, cross-referencing them with evidence that had been collected in 1981 but never fully understood. The modified hydraulic controls he described were consistent with mechanical anomalies that had been noted but never explained during the original investigation. However, the passage of time had eliminated most opportunities for meaningful follow-up. The 2 professional criminals Eddie had described were impossible to identify based on his limited knowledge of their identities. The warehouse where planning meetings had occurred had been demolished in the 1990s. Physical evidence from the original crime scene had been disposed of years earlier as part of routine file maintenance. Most significantly, the statute of limitations had indeed expired on all charges related to the 1981 heist. Eddie could not be prosecuted for his role in the robbery, nor could the estate of Carlos Hernandez face any legal consequences. The confession was essentially a historical curiosity. interesting to law enforcement professionals and the media, but without practical legal implications. The Pacific Security Transport Company, which had absorbed the loss 30 years earlier, issued a brief statement acknowledging Eddie's confession, but noting that their insurance claim had been settled decades ago. The Federal Reserve indicated that the incident had led to improved security protocols that remained in effect, making similar crimes much more difficult to execute. For Eddie Morales, the aftermath of his confession brought mixed results. The psychological burden he had carried for 3 decades was indeed lighter, replaced by a different but more manageable form of stress. He faced criticism from some community members who felt betrayed by his revelation, but he also received support from others who admired his decision to finally tell the truth. His relationship with Carlos's family remained strained. Maria Hernandez struggled to reconcile her memories of her husband with the reality of his criminal past, and their children grappled with questions about the source of their family's financial stability during their childhood years. The $2.9 million stolen in 1981 was never recovered, though investigators estimated that most of it had been legitimately invested or spent over the 3 decades following the heist. The portion received by Carlos and Eddie had been integrated into the legitimate economy through their business and personal expenses, making recovery impossible even if legal grounds existed for such action.